Hi everyone, I'm Christoph Scholl. I'm also on the organism committee, and I have the honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Sherilynn Black for her keynote speaker, our second keynote speaker. So Dr. Black got her undergrad degree from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in psychology with a minor in biology in 2001, and she graduated with highest honors. And she was also Moorhead King Scholar while she was an undergrad. She then went on to the University of Duke University in Durham, and she got her Ph.D. in neurobiology in 2008. While she got her Ph.D., she was also working in further educational studies in the education department in the School of Education at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. That was followed by postdoctoral training at Duke from 2009 to 2012. And while she was there, she also became the founding director of the Office of Biomedical Graduate Diversity for Duke University School of Medicine. And in this function, Dr. Black worked to bring talented, underrepresented graduate students to Duke and to enrich their experience over the course of their PhDs through a series of professional development opportunities, academic enrichment programs, and mentoring programs. During this time, Dr. Black's efforts led to doubling the number of applications to the biomedical program, and within 5 years, and she also was successful in raising the matriculation rates and the fellowship rates obtained from candidates. Dr. Black was in 2012 promoted to assistant professor of the practice of medical education at Duke, first in the departments of ophthalmology and then clinical science, and in 2013 she was promoted in the medical education at the Duke School of Medicine. Since 2017, she is Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement at Duke, and in this position she brings leadership to many areas of faculty advancement, including support for pre-tenure and mid-career faculty, professional development of non-tenure system faculty, and mentoring. And she also works to increase the diversity of faculty among all ranks. Dr. Black has been funded by various funding organizations, the NIH, Merck Foundation, Bio Foundation, and the University of Wisconsin for a long time. She has been principal investigator on many grants, and she is also a very well sought after consultant by various organizations working on diversity. So she has worked with NIH, HHMI, AMMC, the Society for Neuroscience, and the Boris Wellcome Fund. She also has won many honors and awards. I'll just give you a few. So Dr. Black got the Samuel Dubois Cook Society Award. She got an award from Duke for the Community Service Award, the Dean's Award for Inclusive Excellence in Graduate Education, and the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Award. Also, Dr. Black is an alumni of the Sagnes Linden Pudry Institute, and that's actually where our paths kind of crossed. For those in the audience, Dr. Black was very helpful in helping one of my undergrad students here get a waiver for the PhD application program at Duke, because the student didn't have the funds to apply, and the student graduated from Duke's PhD program 2 years ago. Dr. Black, thank you.
So Christoph, thank you so much for that introduction. This has just been such a wonderful trip. I've gotten to see so many friends. This is like a little reunion. One of my former BioCore students is here in the back. One of my current research collaborators is here. Friends from the AAMC Great Group are here. It's really been wonderful. So thank you all so much. I'm very honored to be your keynote speaker today, and I'll just say a couple of things. I'm hoping that what my talk today can show you is that, for all of the students who are here and all the postdocs and all the early career faculty, the way that you choose to be a scientist and you shape your career as a scientist, there's so much agency that each of you have as we're starting to think about what the next generation of the biomedical workforce should look like. And I think that, there are ways that training has occurred previously that have gotten a lot of individuals great success, and I think that right now we're at a really important historical inflection point where we have the opportunity to really enact some systemic change and to reduce some barriers so that we can make sure that all of your brilliant minds have the space and the agency to do science in the way that you're meant to do it. So I'm hoping that my talk can bring some of that today. I also want to say, as beautiful as JP's talk was, I'm going to PowerPoint you so hard in this talk. There will not be, there's like one custom animation that took me like an hour to figure out, and so thank you for going before me to try to show me up on the animation front. That's
You're right
great.
down the street.
Yeah, whatever, sure. Okay. So, I'm going to start out because I want to talk about the way that I view the academy, because I think that one of the things that is usually challenging for sort of the people who study education, and then there are the people who do basic science research, and I fall right in the middle of that, is that really if you think about the academy and you think about it from a systems biology approach, it is an ecosystem of variables that we're talking about. And usually when you think about the way that the academy can be manipulated or changed if you impact one of the variables, it's things like the policies, the behaviors, the resources, the lived experiences of the individuals in the system, and the institutional values that influence the way that the system can operate and how robust its health is. Then you bring in sort of these secondary factors that all of a sudden start to paint out the different ways that the ecosystem can change. And so it's things like the faculty and students and staff that are in the system, the donors who fund the system, the people who lead the system, the mission that's espoused by the university versus what the actual lived experiences are in the systems, societal events that are happening around the system. All of these things impact the way that the academic ecosystem can function. And so we know that a lot of the talk these days has been what we need to do is diversify this system, because if we bring diversity into this system, there are many benefits that will help the academy. And so many of you are probably familiar with this work showing that research has shown that diversity benefits innovation, decision-making, functioning of complex systems. Also, diverse teams and businesses drive performance, talent acquisition, improve retention, and foster innovation. There's a lot of data about this. One of the people who study this the most you may have heard of is Scott Page. These are two seminal books he's written, The Difference and The Diversity Bonus, really showing the impact that diversity has on improving systems. And there are a lot of polls that are being done right now, trying to understand, especially because of the political climate and a lot of things that have happened, to try to really get a feel about how does the public actually feel about this notion of DEI as it's sort of been used in the media lately. And what we found, so this is a poll from Pew Research Center that came out at the beginning of April, so it's very recent. The majority of the workforce in the United States still think that focusing on DEI at work is a good thing, right? So regardless of sort of the stories that we're hearing, 56% think it's a good thing. We need to have different types of people in work environments. 28% neither good nor bad. Only 16% are actually sort of using the sort of negative weaponized concerns of like this is a bad thing. So if we think about this from the perspective that most people think it's a good thing, and we know that there are a lot of ways that it can benefit the workforce, the obvious thought is that you start a lot of initiatives. And many of you here, I've had the pleasure of meeting, belong to a number of these initiatives that are listed here. So if you think about the years between 2020 and 2023, there have been lots and lots of increases nationally to support the ideas of advancing the biomedical workforce. Some of the programs listed here existed before 2020, like the Burroughs Wellcome PDEP and GDEP programs, and the Gallian Fellows and Hannah Gray. Freeman Hrabowski is new, CZI is new, the FIRST initiative is new, and then Mosaic is relatively new. So we've seen a sharp increase in the number of these programs. Like I said, I know many of you here have benefited from these programs, and a lot of institutions that previously did not have any efforts in this area are beginning to see some results in their demographic shifts because of this. But what we also know is that when you increase diversity rapidly, which many of these programs are helping us to do, it means that our collective capacity to notice blind spots and inequities will also increase. Because what that means is that you're bringing in different types of individuals into spaces that have previously been largely homogenous groups of individuals, into status quo in organizations that were designed for certain majority groups of individuals. So you start to see different perspectives that may show us our systems are not always optimally designed for everyone's success. So there's a psychologist named Claude Steele, who many of you may have heard of. He is known for developing the phrase stereotype threat. Many of you have heard of that. It's the idea that if you belong to an underrepresented group, you sort of operate with the assumption and the fear that you will perpetuate stereotypes about that group, which will lead you to sort of diminish capacity to engage in your work. So Claude Steele has been sort of examining this phenomenon as we are doing this rapid demographic representation increase, and he's calling it diversity churn. And he actually has a new book that's about to come out about this topic. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go to a listening session he did to sort of advise the way that this term is being used. What we talked about in that listening session was that there are a number of interventions that are being done nationally at a very high level to address some of that churn. So, you all may have read a number of these sort of seminal papers, looking at the composition of NIH study sections to understand why certain groups don't get funded at the same rate that others do. Trying to understand what motivates certain groups to persist in Ph.D. and postdoc and faculty positions where other groups have higher rates of attrition. Looking here at gender bias that still exists despite 30 solid years of interventions at institutional level, still having really significant issues with gender bias and a lot of interventions focusing on that. Mental health challenges that are greatly increased in underrepresented students on college campuses due to race-related PTSD symptoms that are emerging over the last few years. So these papers have really opened up just a number of interventions to try to deal with that churn, with the idea that you diversify a space rapidly, a lot of different issues result because the space itself was not permissive to allow everyone to thrive, and as a result, you try to make sure that the individuals in that space can succeed. Now, another thing that I like to think about when I think about churn is the fact that it's not about the individual who cannot persist in that churn. It's about the fact that the system that the individual is in is not designed for that individual to be successful. And I think that that's something that's very important for us to think about because over the last few years, we've seen all of these programs popping up, but the work environments are the same. So we're bringing individuals in and we're saying, oh, we really appreciate the diversity of this person, but what we're asking them to do is assimilate into a system that removes the benefit that their diversity brings into that space. So I think that churn is an interesting thing for us to think about because I think a lot of people are beginning to say, oh, this means that increasing demographic representation is not the best thing for our systems, when in fact we have data showing that it is, and not only that, but that the systems are what are most in need of change, not the individuals that are in them. Now, despite that data, we know what's happening societally. There are more than 20 states right now currently involved in legislation to remove equity issues to change those systems. This is one that I pulled, but there are many that are very similar. This is from the University of Florida, effectively eradicating all work related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. All individuals hired in those spaces and the faculty even who are studying those spaces are getting impacted by this. So despite the data that shows that this is a benefit, there's a misalignment with the way that we are able to use funds and resources to tackle these goals. But something that's interesting to me is that there was another public poll that was done. This one was in May by a Morning Consultant Public-Private Strategies Institute. They surveyed over 200 key leaders in different businesses and academia around the country, and they found that despite what the public narrative is, those leaders are still willing to remain committed to diversity initiatives in spite of external pressures, because they have actually seen the benefit of diversity in their companies, in their institutions, when it's actually working well with well-managed teams and resources. So I wanted to start out my talk this way to let you all know that, yes, there is a lot going on that's difficult in the country right now. And I know a lot of you have talked to me about that while I've been here today, about the pressure that you feel, worrying that you won't be able to run your labs the way you want to or any careers you want to go into, that these opportunities may not be there, your fellowship programs may not be there. The data that's out there right now shows that most leaders are willing to keep going. So I want to use that as the framing as I move into the talk about my research. So when I think about these questions, knowing that there's a willingness to still engage and knowing that we need to think about creating systems that are equitable instead of focusing on individuals that are equitable, The main questions that I think about is, how can the academy reflect scholarly excellence in the identities and innovative perspectives of individuals and equitable practices and policies that promote and support all of its members? So you notice the questions that I tend to think about are about the way that the system can support this excellence to thrive, as opposed to thinking about how can the individuals be intervened on. And so the way that I've been approaching this work for the last few years is really thinking about how to create a permanent, stable culture of equity that systematically assesses needs through holistic approaches, amplify the identity of all the individuals in the system as a necessary component of innovation and scholarly excellence, and use evidence-based approaches to drive systemic change. Not an easy thing to do. But thinking about all three of these points really means that you are creating a holistic system that is allowing people to bring their authentic selves into that space and to do the science the way that they would like to approach it, and making sure that all of the work to keep them there and help them to persist and be retained is used through evidence-based, rigorous work. The same way we would do any scientific experiment that we would do if we're thinking about challenging topics. So as a neuroscientist, I approach all of this work through cognition, because this is what I study. And something that I think a lot of people don't really match together when they think about equity work, like how does that match with neuroscience? Well, the reality is that cognitive processes inform how we each experience equity, because we all have different backgrounds and different identities, and all of that influences the way that we experience one another and our ideas about what equity should look like and how systems should best work. So, for example, if you think about perception, which is a main cognitive process that a lot of social neuroscientists study, it's the perception of who deserves pay increases, who deserves admission to programs, who deserves to be hired, the motivation of individuals in those systems to do the equity work. Thinking about how you influence public sentiment and a willingness to engage to do this work. All of these go around the cognitive process of perception. If you think about bias, many of you have heard about bias, you've probably gone to bias trainings, bias talks. The reality is there are actually 12 different forms of cognitive biases. So people talk a lot about implicit bias, but there are so many different types of cognitive biases that impinge on one another and influence our ability to change our behaviors. One of the main biases that's come up in the literature over and over is the bias to be able to select appropriate academic leaders. And this is one where there have been a number of studies looking at, as we increase gender in STEM, why is it that the ratio of leaders continues to skew heavily in male for whatever reason? There are lots of biases about who we think deserves to be a leader and what leaders look like. And finally, rationalizations of which topics are worthy of research funding. Things like this, rationalizing why, if you're on a search committee, you pick one candidate over another. Why, if you're doing graduate admissions, this student just feels like a better fit for your program, and you can't necessarily articulate it with data, but you can rationalize it with yourself that they will be more successful. All of these kinds of examples relate back to cognitive processing. So for me, I design what are called interventions. And this means that you intervene on human behavior. So if you're doing a scientific experiment on a cell, for example, you would think about ways that you could change the environment around the cell and see if you could change the cell's behavior. Similarly, when I design an intervention, I think about ways to change the system around the individual to see if I can change that individual's behavior. So when I design cognitively based, they call them sort of intervention science experiments, I use both affective and cognitive approaches to do this work. So when you think about the two, here we go. If you think about the different ways that we engage in intervention science, there's first something called observable engagement. And these are the kinds of things that you've probably heard about a lot. Like people, you think about the sort of metrics that people have used for notions of meritocracy for a very long time. So these are the academic observable engagements, are things like number of publications, number of funding rates, matriculation rates, graduation rates, hiring and attrition rates. You also think about some behaviors, but these are the kinds of behaviors that have been designed by the system that you're opting into. So these are things like, what are your academic and scholarly persistence rates? So like how many people have been able to opt into your system and survive in that system? What are the productivity rates? How many people have different numbers of collaborations? All of these things go back to observable engagement. So these are things we can very easily assess about one another by looking at one another and looking at the system. The areas that I am actually more interested in are things that are called internal engagements. So these are the cognitive factors that influence the academic and behavioral engagement. So for example, what are the things that you value? How does that play into the decisions that you make for persistence? What is your alignment of work with those values? What motivates you? How do you rationalize staying in or opting out of a situation? And what kind of avoidance patterns do you have when it comes to dealing with difficult topics like race, like gender in the workplace? I also think a lot about the affective aspects when I'm designing interventions. So these are things like feelings of belonging, sentiments of connectedness, affirmation, purpose, entitlement. It's what it feels like to be in a space. So I'm sure that if I asked each of you right now, which department are you in? You could tell me the department that you're in. But then if I say, what does it feel like to be a member of that department? Well, that's a very different question. Because then it starts coming down to, what is your personal experience like in your lab? Is it a positive one? Do you feel included? Do you feel valued? What is it like when you're sitting in a classroom? What is it like when you're mentoring someone else? So all of these things go into the affective bucket of internal engagement, where you start thinking more about how you experience a space as opposed to you just being in a space. You following me so far? Okay. Sometimes this can be a little heady because it is very cognitive focused, and so I'm trying to make sure that this point comes home. So when I design interventions, I really think hard about the cognitive process and the affective components of the experience of the space to make sure that they will properly motivate groups for their specific outcomes that they're seeking. So this means that there has to be a lot of knowledge about the way that we operationalize feelings that we have and thoughts that we have and perceptions that we have and translate those into behaviors and outcomes. Another piece that I do is focus on theoretical frameworks because those really help to advance equity. And the one that I want to highlight today is from one of my good friends and research collaborators, Beronda Montgomery, which is called groundskeeping. And when you think about academia as a gatekeeper or a groundskeeper, the current model that most of us are familiar with is one that would be called gatekeepers. And I think this is something that's probably pretty evident to us, right? There is a gate that represents a barrier that we have to overcome to get to the next step. So you can imagine, for example, if you are outside of a PhD program, here is a gate, which would probably in this case be the admissions committee. If you're deemed worthy, you can make it through that gate. But then you get into different layers of internal gatekeeping. Do you pass your qualifying exam? Do you get picked for a lab? Do you get research funding? Do you get to participate in different opportunities? All of those are areas where things like bias can come into play when you're training students. Selective mentoring. Do you have the same opportunity to get the same sort of engagement with mentors as you're in your program? And then ultimately at the bottom of that, success happens. So what this means is that you are beholden to all of the gates that are in the system that you're in to get to success. Beronda's theory is called groundskeeping. And the idea of groundskeeping is that everyone that's inside of an ecosystem, like the academic ecosystem that I just described to you, have to facilitate themselves as environmental stewards to make the system a success. And one of the ways that Beronda always explains this, which I think is a great way to say it, is, how many of you here have any plants in your house? Does anybody have a plant? Oh my gosh, a lot of you. This is like good mental health to have plants in your house. If your plant is wilting, shout out some things that you do to help the plant to grow. Water, sun, soil, repotting, move it. Okay, I didn't hear anybody say, that plant just needs to be more resilient. I didn't hear anyone say, that plant isn't tough enough. I don't know why, but that plant just doesn't feel like the right fit for this pot, right? You immediately go to the environment. You say, this plant has value. This plant is a special plant. It should be able to grow. Something in the environment must be faulty. This is what groundskeeping means. So the way that Beronda has defined this is that you welcome all contributions to the environment. You make everything a growth mindset. You tend to the environment to support individual and collaborative contributions and collective success. So in groundskeeping, you identify and operate from strengths instead of deficits. You support areas and opportunities for growth. And then you have stewardship of environmental contexts and resources to support rather than fix individuals. So those things you just mentioned for the plants, those are supporting the growth of the plant. It is not fixing the plant or changing the plant or asking the plant to assimilate. It is fixing the environment and supporting it so that it can continue to flourish in the way that sees fit for its specific growth. And that also means that you remove barriers and build bridges, which is, a lot of the things that you all mentioned when you were shouting out what you do to help your plants. So Baranda and I came together after, just a long time of sort of me doing my interventions and her writing theory, and we said, what if we create a new way that the academy can start to think about these issues, where we use her theoretical framing and we use my ability to design affective interventions. We create a new model that can help to promote systemic change at the highest levels in a way that can be persistent and that institutions can thrive in this new groundskeeping state of mind. And so what we did was we came up with a novel approach where we integrated the frameworks into intervention science. And this paper will hopefully be out any day, not quite there yet, but it's in final revisions. But the idea is that you take the theoretical frameworks that are relevant for your local context. Like I said, I like to use groundskeeping. I'm going to go through a couple of other frameworks as I go through my interventions that you'll see how I use those. And then you also use intervention science where you design programs or initiatives or policies that are based on data and evidence-based approaches. You apply behavioral and cognitive approaches that are connected to motivation to increase the likelihood of successive outcomes. And then we have a number of steps here that we think that you should walk through, and you'll see how this plays out as I go through some of the experiments I'm about to mention to you. But it's about clearly identifying the issues that you want to address and simplifying the context to clarify the issue, considering the environmental context, selecting a theoretical framework that best matches the primary cause, consider contextual affordances, which I will explain to you in a moment, thinks about the types of engagement, both the observable and the internal, that will be required to resolve the issue, design an intervention map to set framework with the context in mind, to apply for the contextual affordances and types of engagement, and include methods of assessment to assess the success of your chosen approach. These things might seem like, now that I've walked through this, of course these are things that you should be doing. But in our experience in the academy, this is not the way that institutions usually approach work relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of it is anecdotal. A lot of it is based off of gut instinct, or University X did this, so we're going to try it. This is an approach that we believe you will be able to use whether you are in a lab, whether you are in a company, whether you are at an institution, and I'm going to walk through with you what some of this looks like when it's actually in action. So for the first approach to changing the system, one of the gates that I have been very interested in intervening on is the gate of mentorship. And there are a number of reasons why it's important to think about mentorship as it relates to persistence in STEM. There's a lot of research about it being important for the long-term success of trainees and research career pathways. It impacts research productivity, academic and research self-efficacy, and career satisfaction. And research mentoring relationships in particular, thinking about the relationships between mentees and their mentors in the lab, really deeply impacts mentee self-perceptions and positive STEM outcomes. And I was very fortunate to be on the consensus study for the National Academies that wrote the report on reimagining graduate education. And we found that the number one indicator to determine if someone goes on from being in training to being a faculty member is their relationship with their research mentor. Previously, the thought was that it was number of publications, impact factor of publications, and grant funding. That is not the case. Overwhelmingly, it is the relationship with the research mentor. So I think that really began to heighten the importance of the fact that we have to get these relationships right if we want to talk about persistence, because that is the number one indicator in the system of persistence in the STEM outcome. Now, where does cultural awareness fit into mentorship? Well, culture defines who we are, how we engage with the world. I think that's something that's probably obvious to most of us who are in this room. But I think what's not always obvious is that at the level of thinking about a mentorship relationship, mentees and mentors all have unique perspectives, which means their personal backgrounds and beliefs all play into how they experience one another. And so that means that there may be misalignment in expectations, and that the perspective and scope of what we ask of mentors or ask of mentees may not be aligned with cultural relevance in mind. Now, one of my collaborators, Angela Byers-Winston, previously did a study asking a very simple question. Should you address cultural diversity directly in the mentoring relationship? And look at these numbers. About half of the faculty said, yes, I should do this. Look at the mentees. Almost 90% of them said, yes, we have the expectation that faculty should be able to talk to us about this, regardless of what our background is. If there's something going on societally, there's an expectation from the mentees that the faculty should be able to talk to them about it. And if the mentee themselves is going through something in this area, there is an expectation that faculty members should know how to address that. When this data came out, it was terrifying for basic science faculty. Because for many of them, this is not an area where they feel that they have competence. They are, I hear all the time, I work all over the country, I hear people say, I was not trained to do this. And I say, well, you also weren't trained on how to design a budget for a lab, but here you are, right? So this is part of the job of us being faculty. And the way that I think about this all the time is the awards that we've all won are because we have tackled complex problems. There's no reason that we should be afraid to think about something that could actually be causing harm to a student that we're training. So I think that, building that capacity in faculty is a critical component to get this difference here, reduced in size. So to do that work, I collaborated with an amazing team of scholars, one of whom is here today, Bruce Spearin, to think about how to increase cultural awareness and mentorship practices of mentors. And the model that we used was the HHMI Gilliam Fellows program. So I know some of you here are Gilliam Fellows, and I know that this would be very familiar to you because the people who are here who are Gilliam Fellows, your advisors participated in this experiment. Little did they know. And if you want to read more about this, this paper is out in CBE Life Sciences, and I'm happy to give any of the references from this talk if they would be helpful. So the theoretical framework that we use as we came up with the curriculum to work with these mentors is called the social cognitive career theory. And you can see here that this theory is largely focused on the fact that personally held identities can impinge on learning experiences, again, the interventions, and they can lead to a pipeline of self-efficacy outcomes that impact interests, goals, actions, and outcomes, and these can lead to outcome expectations. The real thing I want you to pay attention to in this model is that background and contextual affordances, remember I mentioned that term earlier, these are the things like socioeconomic status, your education level, your background, your role-based capital, all of these different areas, along with your personally held identities, such as race, gender, gender identity, ethnicity, your age, those all impinge on these proximal contextual influences, and these are what lead to your ability to have successful experiences and learning outcomes. So we really thought a lot about those three areas of this model in particular to think about designing a curriculum that will lead to the most heightened experience and behavior change possible. So to do this program, we ran it for 1 year, and I want to give perspective to that. I actually wrote this wrong. It's 25 to 30 hours, not 25 to 20 hours. This is the equivalent of taking a semester-long course at a college or university. So I want to just give you all perspective for how much work and effort the mentors put in to get the results that I'm going to show you. There's a lot of questions about dosage effects for mentorship trainings, for example. Like faculty would say, oh, I took a program for an hour, I checked that box, I go on. More and more and more, especially as more neuroscientists are getting into this space, we're finding that to truly cause shifts in behavior that are sustained and longitudinal, it requires longitudinal engagement and repeated measures with information to actually motivate us properly to change behaviors. So for this approach, it was a multimodal platform. Some were webinars on things like the science of mentorship, some very practical topics like mentorship compacts, individual development plans, communication strategies, challenges and solutions. We also did a lot of resource sharing with these mentors. They also did online learning modules that were self-led called Optimizing the Practice of Mentoring and then Culturally Aware Mentoring. But very importantly, we had 2 face-to-face intensive workshops with them that were held on the Howard Hughes campus, where we tackled the most challenging topics and the most sensitive topics relating to mentorship, where they felt that they had the least efficacy and capacity to work. And so those were done in person over 2.5 days. And then we also had other webinars where we continued discussion. Very importantly, all of the program elements that are a part of this intervention were previously tested and validated measures from different ones of our R01s and grants that we have. So each of these sections was not just sort of created. All of these were interventions that were run separately, measured, assessed, validated, and then put into a larger body, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to test the effectiveness of it. So total, we ran this for 116 mentors and 119 mentees from over 50 institutions. So when we look at retrospective pre-post data, we see increases in cultural awareness and communication after the mentors took the training, so that was wonderful. Things like knowing when it's appropriate to raise the topic of race and ethnicity in my mentoring relationships, intentionally creating opportunities for my mentees to bring up issues of race and ethnicity when they rise, having strategies to address these sorts of things in my mentoring relationships, and importantly, putting myself in a vulnerable position when it comes to discussions of race and ethnicity. We also looked out for actual behavioral changes 1 year after the program, because as you know, there's also a bolus effect after you do something like this where you have really high levels of self-efficacy, where you're like, I feel amazing, I just took this training, I know how to be an effective mentor. But then when it actually comes to integrating the knowledge into behavioral change, that's most of the times where people get stuck. Fortunately, after this experience, which again went over the course of a year for many, many hours and many repeated measures, the faculty actually did see behavior change as a result of that. So, you can see here, if you look for sometimes, frequently, and all of the time, which are the light blue, the gray, and the green, you can see that that's the majority of all of these bars. I created opportunities for my mentees to bring up these issues as they arose. I implemented specific strategies to address racial and ethnic diversity in my research mentoring relationships. I was willing to discuss these topics with my mentee, even if it made me uncomfortable. So we were very encouraged by the increase that we saw, not only in their perception that they were doing well, but in the actual behaviors that they reported a year after the program. And you can see the kinds of things that this sort of program, although it was focused on mentorship, had in other areas of the academy. This person here gave information saying that they were going to think about diversity and admissions committees in their departments, and they want to use evidence to change attitudes now. They have more humility and better understanding about different experiences and cultures. This person says they're going to dramatically change their role in Ph.D. admissions and mentoring in their labs. And really importantly, after all of that work, 100% of the participants said they were likely or very likely to make changes in their practices after the intervention. So this was a huge boost to us to say it is possible to increase knowledge and behavior, not just sort of raise awareness about a topic. But with that being said, we also know that most mentors are not able to engage in such a program for a variety of reasons. They may not have access to it. The amount of time that it takes may not be realistic for them. So we ended up doing a separate experiment with mentors enrolled in REU programs across the country. And for those of you who are not familiar, REU programs are summer programs that allow students to get access to working in labs and understand what it means to be a scientist before they start school. And so we ran a randomized controlled trial that tested the effectiveness of a novel virtual curricular model to enhance cultural awareness to see how that would result in behavior changes following the program. And I did this also in collaboration with Angela and Chris, and also with Janet Branshaw and others who are at the University of Wisconsin. These are the two publications that came out of it. If you'd like to read more in depth about the actual intervention beyond what I share today, one in Understanding Interventions and one in Science Advances. So the approach for this intervention, for this one was larger. We had 216 research mentors from across the country, 117 students involved in research. So this was important because this allowed us to get individual data from the mentors and paired data from the students who are working with them in real time. So that was very powerful for us to see how impactful this actually was. This one was much shorter. It was 4 two-hour sessions, so 8 hours total. We did it as a synchronous online curriculum. That means that everyone was online at the same time together, going through the modules together. So we were facilitating online, but everyone was there at the same time. There were no asynchronous components. We built the curricular templates with validated instruments, the same way we did the experiment with the Gilliam program. We use entering mentoring, which is something that many of you may be familiar with through SIMMER, through the University of Wisconsin, that Chris Fund authored in 2006. And then we also use practices of culturally aware mentoring. Many of you may have heard of this referred to as CAM before. So Angela Byers-Winston authored that in 2018. We used those and built this new module called Enhanced Cultural Awareness and inserted it into this existing curriculum that a lot of institutions are already using. So we thought that that way it would make it a more accessible way, since so many institutions are already using entering mentoring, to see if we could change things using that as the experimental condition. And then we did the control was using entering mentoring without this new curriculum included. So to develop this module, I used what's called the theoretical framework for the multicultural competency model by Sue. And this focuses on increasing knowledge, raising awareness, but also changing your skills as a result of the increase of that awareness and knowledge. And so it was a mix of engaging in personal cultural self-reflection and also learning more about the lived experiences of underrepresented STEM students. I will talk more about this later, but this is one of the top areas that mentors from majority groups struggle with, is making a connection between their own lived experience and the experience of someone from an underrepresented group, simply because they have not had what's called, so there are different sources of self-efficacy. One of the sources of self-efficacy is one where you believe you can do something because you've seen someone else do it, so therefore you believe that you can do it. It's called mastery efficacy. And in this case, for a lot of the mentors, because they have not seen a lot of their colleagues being able to successfully mentor underrepresented students, or they themselves don't feel that they have a connection with their background, there can be some blocks with communication and understanding. So we thought about all of that as we created this new curriculum, and these are the learning objectives that the mentors were expected to do during the 8 sessions: expand their understanding of cultural diversity and mentoring relationships, recognize the impact of biases and assumptions, increase awareness of cultural diversity in oneself and in others. That was an important one. And communicate effectively across dimensions of cultural diversity and consider power dynamics between mentors and mentees. So you can see here, we first did an assessment of looking at the CAM skills. Again, I mentioned that CAM was one of the validated measures that we used as a part of this curriculum. And you can see here that all of the CAM skills showed statistically significant increases in all of the people in the experimental group who did the new module compared to the control module. So, making a plan to increase my culturally aware mentoring practices, intentionally create opportunities for mentees to bring up issues of race and ethnicity when they arise, encouraging mentees to think about how research relates to their own lived experiences, helping them feel comfortable in the labs that they're in, and respectively broaching topics of race and ethnicity and mentoring relationships. This one about racial broaching was really important. Last night I was sharing with the group at dinner that I did an intervention in 2020 for about 200 basic science faculty about discussing race in the lab. I will not say where I did it, but I will ask you all a question, and those of you who were at dinner last night cannot answer. I asked the faculty in the audience on a scale of 1 to 5, because broaching goes from avoidant to infusing, where the top 3 categories of broaching are, listening more than you're speaking, allowing the other person to help explain their identity to you. Avoidant is like avoiding all discussion of race because you're uncomfortable. So on a scale of 1 to 5, I asked the faculty, how many of you think you're in the top 3 categories of broaching? This was 200 basic science faculty. What % of those faculty do you think thought that they were in the exemplar category for racial broaching? Yell it out. 10? I heard a 10 and a 90. What else?
5.
5. Someone said 100. Huh? What else?
16 or less.
15 or less. Okay. 80% of the faculty perceive themselves to be in the top 3 categories to talk about race in 2020. So there were some perceptual challenges. And we knew that having an intervention about respectfully racially broaching was going to be really critical, because there is a perception of ourselves, and we talked about this last night too. You may have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, this psychology. theory where, when you are a person who is high achieving in certain areas, you overextend the assumption that you will be able to succeed in other things. And so all of us here are scientists, we're all smart people. It is natural that we would overestimate our ability to be able to talk about something like this because we usually do well in every other area that we look at. So these are the things that we looked at for that curriculum. If you look here at the mentor data, wanted you all to see that, again, since this was an online training, I know there can be sort of an initial feeling about online trainings. But when we looked at, did people find them valuable, that, the vast majority of the content was rated from extremely valuable to very valuable or moderately valuable, which to us was very important because it meant that the faculty who went through those 8 hours actually they could feel their behaviors changing, and they did not view this as sort of a waste of time or a perfunctory exercise. But even more important was when we looked at the paired data. And these were the kind of questions that we asked the students in the REU programs about their mentors in real time as they were taking the sessions. So my mentor approached the topic of race and ethnicity with me in a respectful manner. You can see that the control group is here. This is the experimental group. So there's definitely a difference that the students in the REU programs felt about their mentor's ability to approach those topics. Similarly, my mentor created opportunities for me to bring up issues of race and ethnicity as they arose. You can see a significant change between the comparison and experimental groups when the ECA module was included in the curriculum. And this is really important because for many of the mentors from majority groups, there is a challenge for them to be able to link their own identity, whatever that looks like for them, to notions of diversity and equity. And that is because of the way that those topics have typically been handled in the academy, is that it's usually bucketed where certain groups are in and then others are sort of out. And then it's up to the other group to opt into that discussion or opt out. What we tried to do with this curriculum was to say that everyone is a part of culture. Everyone has a culture and identity. And it's not about opting in. It's about us moving to different spaces of that experience to be able to support the students in the most effective way. So when I think about, that gate, as I mentioned, the gate of mentorship practices, we've shown that it can result in shifts in behavior changes that significantly influence the lived experiences of the individuals in the training environments. For me, that is always the most central and relevant point, because if you change a practice or a policy, but the lived experience does not change for the person you're trying to help, then I consider that policy change a failure. So I think that is something that's very important. Also, that enhancing cultural awareness and mentorship can increase alignment and expectations of practice between mentors and their mentees. Misalignment in expectations can oftentimes lead to attrition. There's almost a one-to-one correlation between those 2 points. So this is something that we know improves that situation. And then also, building agency and mentorship capacity and mentors benefits experiences for all individuals in the systems, not just for the group most impacted. A lot of the qualitative data that we got from those studies were people saying things like, my lab mates also really appreciate that my advisor took this because now they're doing mentorship compacts for all of us. My mentor is now giving all of us a chance to talk about, topics A, B, and C, where before they were shutting all of us down. So really building agency and capacity in those mentors to have those experiences really helps the entire system, not just individuals from underrepresented groups. So the last intervention that I want to talk to you about is sort of building on those 2. So those first 2 interventions about mentorship were at the individual level, right? Because we're talking about working with faculty who are working with students and intervening on that relationship between the 2 of them and seeing if we can change the faculty's behavior to change the experience and the outcome for the student. But if we look here at the social change model, there are a number of different tenets that have to be considered if you want to think about changing a system. So there are individual values that are about the consciousness of self, congruence, and commitment. But you can also look at group level and society level values that are more about how you collaborate, sharing a sense of purpose, being able to navigate controversy with civility, and also just thinking about the type of citizenship that you embody being a part of that system. So this is where you start thinking about, while you're doing these interventions that are focusing on faculty, there also need to be system level changes that are giving leverage to thinking about policies, resources, and institutional priorities at the same time. So this theoretical framework that I just mentioned is a social change model of leadership development, and this is a lot of the work that Bruce and myself and our colleague Sonia Zarate have been thinking about a lot with another set of experiments that we'll hopefully be able to share with you soon. Now, one thing that we know when we're talking about systemic change is that leaders are paramount in that change. And another piece of data that came from that same survey that I mentioned to you earlier is that leaders said that they're eager for clarity on the rules of the road, and they want support in the form of data and tools. So basically, if you want a leader to build change and build capacity, they're saying, I'm open to it, but I need guidance about how to move forward, especially as the legal landscape is shifting in this country. And as I showed you earlier, there are over 20 states that are in legislation about DEI. A lot of the institutions that are reaching out to me right now are doing it under the tenet of, I don't know what I'm allowed to do anymore. I used to do things this way. I don't know how to do them. This program is gone. I just need help to understand what to do. So for the last piece that I want to talk to you about, I pulled more from the bottom part of the groundskeeper model, which is thinking about stewardship of environmental context and resources to support rather than fix individuals, and removing those barriers and building bridges. So I wanted to intervene on the gate, in terms of gatekeeping, of faculty and leaders feeling that they have low capacity to move ideas into effective practices. The way that I'm doing that now, I was very fortunate because I was asked to chair the new initiative that the National Academies just launched, which is called the Roundtable on Mentorship, Professional Development, and Well-Being. And my co-chair of that roundtable is Kimberly Griffin, who's the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Maryland. And Kimberly and I's goal is to do exactly what I said for that last groundskeeping bullet. We want to create an opportunity for faculty and leaders to build capacity on how to remove these gates, so that we can change the systems, practices, and policies that are preventing equity at institutions. So we decided that we would look at the intersectional lens of professional development, mentorship, and well-being, because we feel like those are three of the most fundamental components to holistic training environments in STEM, and they have broader impacts to areas outside of the academy as well. Now, since we started, I mean, it's crazy how, society is shifting. Even since we started the roundtable a year ago, there's already been a little bit of an evolution in focus and scope, because we're trying to make sure that we're taking into account all of the contextual affordances that are changing societally. But the priorities remain the same, of making sure that we're giving faculty a space to build capacity in these areas. And I want to just highlight for you the way that I see each of these three going together, because oftentimes when I see trainings or workshops or talks on these, they're always set in discrete buckets. So for example, if you think about all of these influencing each other in a bidirectional way, there are papers about postdocs using IDPs and they say that those IDPs lead to improved mentorship relationships, confidence to complete their training, and increased engagement with career development resources. That is a clear bidirectionality between a professional development tool and mentorship relationship. If you look between mentorship and well-being, faculty, new faculty, early career faculty who are assigned with mentors report significantly higher levels of job satisfaction regardless of faculty rank or track. That obviously shows a connection between having a mentor leading to increased feelings of well-being. If you look between professional development and well-being, increased science identity, self-efficacy, and community and cohort membership, like many of the cohort programs that exist. Increased student persistence towards STEM careers. Again, having feelings of well-being and increased self-efficacy leading to stronger professional development. And finally, a sense of belonging, which is discussed a lot when you talk about things relating to equity. So a sense of belonging across identities can lead to higher levels of engagement, job satisfaction, and reduced stress. These are things that seem that they should all be pretty self-evident, but people have really struggled to see that they're all connected. And I think even furthermore, the reality is these all impinge on equity, because a sense of belonging, having effective mentorship, being able to do IDPs where you can think really deeply about the way you want to engage, and increase science identity, all of those mean that we're reducing the roadblocks for different types of individuals to be in science. And as I mentioned, with that equity being currently impacted by the current state of legislation, if these are all bidirectional, this means that by removing those equity initiatives, professional development, mentorship, and well-being are also threatened as well in terms of the way we're having experiences in training environments. So for the roundtable, The first thing we did was a workshop, which is sort of the intellectual convening that the National Academies pulled, and we focused it on a theoretical framework called the Knowing-Doing Gap, which is by Jeff Pfeffer. And this gap means that you identify the gap between knowledge and action, and you examine the barriers that prevent you from acting when you know what to do. This was something that Jeff's team found is one of the key components that prevents us from having systemic change in the academy. If you think about the amount of information that's out there at any given moment in the world, what we know is only a subset of that information. And then you take from what you know to apply it to doing something. But there's always this residual gap here that is what is effectively motivating you from knowing a solution to actually being willing to engage in that work. And so if you look at the way that this graph is drawn, it really means that it ends up being a subset of what is possible because we're not willing to engage in the same way. So what we tried to do for this first gathering of the roundtable was focus on translating knowledge into effective action. And about 400 people attended that first event from around the country. And what we found was the gap that everyone was repeatedly saying at their institutions, this gap were the leaders. They said it was their department chairs, their DGSs, their deans, their provosts, their presidents. So the perception from many people in the academy across the country were that the leaders were not being bold enough. The leaders were not taking those steps to actually provide the resources, the trainings, the environments to be able to do that work. So the next step that we did was say, well, then let's bring those leaders and talk to them about this. And let's work to build capacity in those leaders to see if that will help them get from point A to point B. And so to do that, we used a theoretical framework of adaptive leadership by Ron Heifetz. And this allows us to think about the challenges in the academy as breaking them down between what are called technical challenges, which are challenges that can be solved by the knowledge of experts and things that we already know about how to do, and then adaptive challenges, which are challenges that require new learning to accomplish those goals. So if you think about something like a technical challenge, this is something where the problem is clear. You know, if you are involved in graduate admissions and you're not using a rubric and you're getting back feedback about students that's all over the place and inconsistent, a technical challenge that could be an easy fix for that might be get a rubric. Make it something that's rigorous, where it's clear everyone has a way to give information in a standardized and validated way. The adaptive part of the problem of admissions might be, but our admissions outcomes still are not representing equity, right? So this might be something where you have to do some new learning to understand why. The rubric might be a way to help to get you to a more standardized process, but the underlying biases about who belongs in the program, that is more of an adaptive challenge. Really, the way that most challenges present to leaders are a combination of technical and adaptive. And so what we worked with the leaders on was figuring out how to hit this sweet spot where they could still make progress on those technical challenges, but also put some real thought into the adaptive challenges that were limiting the people in different institutions across the country. And so for that one, we had over 300 participants. This just happened a couple of weeks ago, where we had 150 senior leaders, so presidents, provosts, deans of schools, department chairs, DGSs, et cetera, all came together. And then we had about 150 people online that were also in groups working together, and those comprised faculty, staff, students, and funders. And for those groups, we created what were called incubation hubs that were informed by intervention science to help the leaders sort of identify the challenges that were limiting their organizations. We heard from some really dynamic speakers, including Julie Posselt, and actually Ron Heifetz himself came and gave a lecture about adaptive leadership to the leaders to help them think about how to manage their own institutions. We heard examples of 6 different interventions that had used adaptive frameworks to find success in their work. And then each of the leaders developed an action plan to move their institution forward. So it was a very powerful experience for a lot of the leaders. Many of your provost presidents were there. So I will be very curious to see how this goes over the next year as they implement the action plans. And they're supposed to be checking in with the national academies in 1 calendar year. If you want to read more about this, there are proceedings from both of these workshops available that I can also share if anyone is interested. And you know, just a few key takeaways from those workshops that I think are relevant. Moving systems forward is going to probably require this combination of adaptive and technical work, which I think that we probably all know, but I think it also helps because oftentimes when we look at systems, the issues are so complex that it can feel overwhelming and we're not sure how to move forward. Creating space for this shared collaborative work is really critical for a lot of leaders. And then also understanding that as scientists, we are going to be drawn to the more challenging aspects of this, but that sometimes looking at the lower hanging fruit of the technical challenges is something that will actually help us to make more ground more quickly. And the last thing I want to say is that each of you in here is a leader in your own right. So regardless of the nature of the position that you hold right now, you still have some level of agency and authority to be able to make and create change in the system that you're currently occupying. So if anyone is interested in joining into this collaborative, there's one final experience that will be happening in the fall of 24. You can contact me directly, I can make sure, and that's for any student, faculty, or staff or leader that's here. So to wrap up, I just want to remind you of the central hypothesis that I mentioned, which was to create a permanent, stable culture of equity that systematically assesses needs through holistic approaches, amplify identities as a necessary component of innovation and scholarly excellence, and using evidence-based approaches to drive systemic change. You saw different interventions from the different levels of the groundskeeping theoretical framework on culturally aware mentorship and moving ideas into effective practices. So just a few final reflections for you all to take home. As you are thinking about all of this work and thinking about, well, how do I apply this to where I am and to my institution and to my lab that I may be starting or maybe thinking about, or any career in the biomedical workforce, if you want to be effective in the work of DEI, you should make interventions that are intentionally designed, draw from theoretical frameworks and evidence-based methodologies and data. You would think about how you would do any scientific experiment, use the same level of rigor when you're thinking about this work to ensure persistence and longitudinal success. Always remembering that cognitive processes are key in these experiences of equity. It's not about feelings, it's not about gut instincts, it's really a cognitive process that you're trying to intervene on to change behaviors. Context matters when you're thinking about different intervention outcomes. So one clear example of that, I showed you some curricular interventions for mentorship, which made sense for that. But for working with a leader, a curriculum is not something that I would choose to work with them. Instead, using these collective decision-making cohorts that we're using for their national academies are much more effective to change those sorts of behaviors we wanted to see. So understanding context when you design an intervention is critical to determine the success. And just remembering, like I said, that each individual has the ability and agency to enact change in their local environment. So that means that as each of you leaves here today, you can be identifying things that are in your labs, in your departments, wherever you are, that you think could use work. These framings will work for all of those. And the final figure that I have here is one from the paper Baranda and I have that's coming out, and it's sort of a roadmap that we've created to thinking about how to change a system. But the thing I just want to leave you with are the factors to change behaviors, which we've talked about, removing those systemic barriers, being able to identify the barriers that are in the way and that are challenging in your specific location, understanding and accepting your personal agency and positionality. So I have faculty tell me all the time, well, I'm not a chair, I'm not a dean, this isn't my role. As faculty, we have so much power. Think about the power dynamics between faculty and students or faculty and postdocs or any other staff member or training environment. We have the power and the agency and the positionality. And for all of you who are in training, you also have agency. We were talking about this last night about what a privilege it is to be able to study science and work towards a Ph.D. So always thinking about our own positionality in the spaces we occupy. Maintaining a growth mindset and avoiding deficit-based approaches, thinking about that system as opposed to the individual. Avoiding egocentricity and approaching equity work as an agent of change. I think that's one that's very important. One of the reasons why data has shown that it's hard for faculty from majority groups to engage in this idea is because it threatens notions of their own meritocracy about how they got to where they are. And it's really important when we do this work to actually think about the groups we want to help and support. And by doing that and removing the egocentricity of it, it will help us to be an agent for change. And finally, amplify and support others' values, identities, and lived experiences. Always center the individuals you're trying to help. So if you're trying to help underrepresented groups, allow their voice to be present in the decision-making process. Whatever it is that you're doing, always amplify and support those values and identities that you have to be able to create change. So I will end there. I want to thank you all so much for your time. These are all of the people who have supported my work and all of the funders who have supported it, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions?
Thank you for your talk. Given that mentorship is one of the top predictors about the success that a student, a PhD student can have, or even a postdoc can have to become an excellent PI someday, what are your thoughts on when young PIs are being evaluated for tenure tracks, having an implementation of some type of mentorship survey where all of the trainees that they've had have to answer, and the score is part of the evaluation of whether or not this person gets tenure. And then once they get tenure, we don't really challenge anymore what if they can lose their tenure with regards to their science, but then 10 years from now, 15 or 20 years, again, there's a survey, and the only thing that could remove or put your tenure in danger is if you've lost your ability to effectively train and continue to provide a safe environment to the future scientists. So what's
Yeah,
your thoughts?
so I would say a couple of things about that. First, it's interesting. So when you go up for tenure, there actually are a lot of evaluations around mentorship and teaching. So student evaluations from classes you've taught are a significant component of what gets evaluated when you go up for promotion. And likewise, especially if you're in like a School of Medicine department, most institutions do look at the success of your mentees and have an opportunity to get feedback for that process. So that usually does happen at most institutions. Now, the part once you get tenure is trickier because for all faculty, the goal is not to become a full professor. There are lots of faculty who become associate professors and hang out there for a while, and so the notion that they're getting evaluated may only come up. Like I know at Duke, for example, we sort of have you have an annual review with your chair, and that determines if you get a merit raise each year. So maybe if you have had an issue with mentorship, that raise may not be as high as it could. But for many faculty, the amount of what that raise is might be sort of negligible compared to the impact that you're having on a student. So, I think in a lot of ways, the work that groups like NIH are doing is helping with some of this. Because I know that at least through NIGMS right now, if you want to be on a T32, you have to have demonstrated capacity for effective mentorship. And if you cannot show that, or if you've had students to leave your lab, or if you have been involved with any sort of investigative process that's been about mentorship with a student, you can't get graduate students. And that, earlier we were talking about what is their currency. For faculty, getting grad students is currency because that's how we keep our research going. So I think that there are things like that are beginning to happen to start to shift the system, but at individual institutions, a lot of it comes down to how willing the chairs and the deans are going to be to implement and enforce that sort of accountability on the faculty. And that is a very individual and uneven landscape nationally right now.
First of all, thank you so much. It was absolutely amazing, and I don't think you need animations at all.
Thank you. I feel
good.
seen and validated. Yeah.
Yeah,
JP.
and my question is,
I was going to say that too.
do you know of any interventions in which, actually act on the level of politicians, and do you think that they would be effective?
Yeah.
And because in general, I tend to believe that I'm a naive person, and I think you're going to say that no, because it's more complicated than that. How would the funding agencies could intervene in the decisions that are being made right now that look, at least for me, very regressive?
Yes, these are great questions. So I do know of some interventions at the level of politicians. How effective they are, I'm not sure. For example, Society for Neuroscience, we have days on the Hill where we go to lobby We go to meet with different politicians that we know have specific interest in this area and talk to them about the benefits. But again, when things are not done at a systematic level and they are reliant on individual relationships and sort of how you feel on the day that I talk to you, in my opinion, that is not an effective way to ensure that an intervention will take seed. And the unfortunate reality is that when you think about the way that politicians are selected, they don't have to opt into anything. The only thing they have to opt into is the perspective of the voters who are selecting them. And as we've seen, many politicians are very willing to ebb and flow where they stand on things according to their electorate. So I would say that if you have ideas about these sorts of things, I know a number of people who would probably be very interested in funding them, because there are a lot of people very interested in this question. I know even our own provost and other leaders are going, academic leaders are going to Capitol Hill, people who have previously not been involved in this discussion, trying to appeal and plead with lawmakers to not make decisions that they may not have proper context or knowledge about. So I mean, this is where you all come in as like the next generation. Like, if you have ideas, there are people like me who know how to like plug in and help you find ways to get those funded. So I think that's a great question.
Hi, thank you so much for an incredible talk. I'm curious to know about information or demographic information regarding the mentors that went through your curricular processes. And did you see a difference in terms of their response to the content that was provided, how well they did in some of the curricular components? I imagine that each mentor has their own individual identity coming into that space, and that they're probably individuals who may be based on age, race, ethnicity, their own lived experience. There must be some variability with how well they did with the mentorship program. That's my first question.
Yeah.
And then my second question is actually about a booster effect of the curriculum. So is there any thought to looking at further out, maybe 5 years, 10 years, how often mentors need to take this type of curriculum, particularly in an environment like DEI where the content is changing and evolving so quickly?
Yeah, both of those are great questions. And going back to thinking about that data, there was definitely a larger increase in the faculty in majority groups than the faculty who are from underrepresented groups that took the curriculum. But what I would say is that there were items that came out for the underrepresented faculty that probably were not anticipated. So for example, when we were working with the mentors of the Gilliam Fellows, there were some faculty from underrepresented groups who found going through the process challenging, because it was bringing up for them things that had happened during their own training experiences. And I remember one of them said to me, like, very plainly, "You're asking me to do things for my student that I still haven't healed from my own training experience that I went through." And so that led to a large discussion that's actually happening right now about developing curricula that are more focused on because especially with all these hiring initiatives that are happening, we're having a bolus of underrepresented faculty coming in. They still deserve to be able to get trained in mentorship, because again, this is not something that many of us learned when we were in training. So for those faculty, it's being very thoughtful and intentional about how to expand that information to them in a way that honors what they actually lived through themselves. So that was one piece. The question that you have about the sort of additive effect of doing all of these sorts of trainings, I think that anecdotally, I would say that the answer is yes. I've actually done some of that work, looking at the additive effects through the local work I'm doing at Duke right now, because I do a lot of series of interventions in the provost office for all the faculty at the university, and we do, at the end of the year, we look at which faculty took, how many took like more than 3, more than 5, and if they did, how is that relating back to things we're hearing about their performance in their units and things like that. But one interesting thing, so I developed a short course on race that was very intense. That was 20 hours for faculty at Duke. It lasted a week, and it was all day, each day for a week. And a lot of the faculty said it was like the most transformative experience they had been through as a faculty member. This was in 2021. So we saw a major increase in 2021 in the faculty's ability to engage in those topics. and then we saw it persist in 22, and we saw it start declining in 23, and then in 24, it is, for some of the faculty, it's almost back to baseline. So what that says is, I'm not sure about additive, but it definitely indicates that repeated measures are a necessary part of this process, that if you don't get the chance to regularly engage in a behavior, I mean, think about if you all try to learn a language, right? The reason why Duolingo works is because it makes you do it every single day. For these sorts of things, for most faculty, they're like trying to avoid getting into these kind of conversations. And then when they do, they're trying to recall information that they learned 3 years ago at a training. That's hard. And so even if they've been through all of this work, unfortunately, when the rubber meets the road, sometimes they're not successful. So I think it is interesting to think about sort of it cumulatively, but I also think even more than that, the repeated measures is what's going to be necessary to change the behaviors long term.
Okay, one quick question and one quick answer.
I'm not sure. Could you speak to how to navigate the continuum of professional mentorship versus that of advising on more of a personal scale?
Yeah. You know, that's one that I think is still being studied and evaluated, largely because of the figure that I showed you with the expectations of the mentees, especially now. So many of the mentees really want to blur the line with their advisors between some of the personal topics and some of the things that are very clearly and specifically related to science. And that has actually led to a lot of climate issues in the departments and the labs, because the level of familiarity sort of expands beyond the scope of a professional relationship, and then that causes difficulty with sort of accountability and things like that. One of the benefits of doing something like a mentorship compact, and this is something that's been one of the interventions that's been suggested to address this sort of issue, is because this is one of the first times it's actually had mentors to have to articulately state the levels of boundaries that they're willing to engage in with that sort of interaction with the student, talking about tenets of professionalism, talking about, you know, their expectations and vice versa. And so thinking about the more personal aspects of the relationship, a lot of mentors have now begun to sort of collaborate with sort of student affairs professionals and professional development professionals at universities to sort of take on part of that load. But I will say, when it comes to topics of well-being and mental health and things like that, that is an area where, despite that getting deeply into the personal realm, it's one where I think there's sort of a concerted effort to help faculty build capacity and understanding signs of when to ask for help and when to get further engagement, because that is an area where no matter how much someone else comes in, you will have more interaction and see that student more than anyone else would. So I would say that it's definitely a continuum. It's definitely a self-selected process, and it's one that people are still continuing to study. Thank you.
Thank you for a really awesome talk. Let's give it a round of applause.